I must press on. Marcus Papadopoulos is editor of Politics First magazine and an excellent guest. I'm glad to welcome him back. Marcus, you know about the arms trade, particularly in the Balkans, in the East and Central Europe. The scale of the weaponry that the terrorist army in Syria are using is so vast, it must be state-backed, no?
Good evening, George, and thank you ever so much for having me back on.
Welcome.
Yes, my observation regarding this revelation about weapons from the Balkans going to the terrorists in Syria, and let's call them terrorists, which they are. Let's not romanticize them as rebels, how Western journalists and Western politicians are. Exactly. These people are terrorists. But my observation is that it demonstrates how America's client states in Eastern Europe, from Croatia to Serbia and so forth, and I say Serbia with great sadness, but Serbia has become a client state of America. But the Americans are using their client states in Eastern Europe to indirectly fight their dirty wars.
Ukraine also is a big source of weapons, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. And the Americans, without a doubt, have orchestrated what is happening in Syria. Without American consent, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar would not be doing what they're doing in Syria without the Americans having given them the green light.
That's absolutely obvious, yeah.
And the amount of weapons that are flowed in to Syria is the reason for why Syria finds itself in year 5 of a terrible conflict, and why tens of thousands of Syrians have died. And you know, Western journalists, they don't like to talk about this figure, but nearly 100,000 Syrian soldiers have perished in this war. And you know, George, in my opinion, the Syrian army is the only moderate force in Syria.
It's certainly the only legal force, and anybody that the Syrian government invites to come to their aid, these are the only legal combatants in this whole picture. Marcus, when these fanatic extremists are cutting people's heads in France, they're called what they are: terrorists, savage, murderers. But when they're doing it in Syria, they're called rebels. How does that work?
Well, I mean, you know, George, that the West has a history of working with Islamic extremists when it suits them. It started in Afghanistan in the 1980s against the Soviet army. It continued in Bosnia during the civil war there. It continued into Libya, and it's continuing to Syria today. The Americans in particular, but also the British and the French, but the Americans especially, they will use repugnant groups to try and achieve geostrategic objectives. And Western media, which is very much a part of the political establishments in Washington and in London, they will disguise the true nature of these people to their domestic audiences. So like you said, when they commit heinous crimes in Paris or Brussels, they're called what they are, terrorists. But when they do the same, for example, in Syria, you don't hear about these atrocities. They're just called rebels, they're just called freedom fighters, they're whiter than white, and they're fighting against this despicable, tyrannical, genocidal...
And yet
Syrian
it's the same people.
And it's exactly the same people, exactly the same ideology. And you know, George, I would like to say this. There's a lot of talk at the moment in Western media about what's happening in Aleppo. Well, do you know something? I don't remember Western journalists for the last 4 years talking about how the terrorists in eastern Aleppo have been killing civilians in the government-controlled parts of Aleppo with artillery fire, with snipering, etc., etc. And, you know, the whole world should really be behind the Syrian military, the Russian military, the Iranian military, and Hezbollah in its attempt to encircle eastern Aleppo, because that parts of Aleppo must be brought under control of the Syrian government, the only legitimate authority in Syria. And by doing that, that will strike a grave blow to terrorists fighting in Syria. And let's just be clear about it. The Syrian army is the heart and soul in the fight against terrorism. And should the Syrian army collapse on the battlefield, to be defeated, which I don't believe it will, but if it did, then the threat posed by ISIS and other terrorist groups to Europe would increase.
Unbelievable. They would be, their black flag would be flying in Damascus, and they'd be on the Mediterranean coast. Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine, thanks as always for an outstanding